Your own government. Your own military. Planning to kill you in the streets of Miami. Stop for a second and look at the grain of this image. It's a high-contrast 35mm photograph, shot on Kodak Tri-X film, processed in a darkroom somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon. The light is harsh, unforgiving. It catches the glint of a silver star on a general's shoulder and the tip of a fountain pen hovering over a document. That pen is poised to change history, not through a treaty or a declaration of peace, but through a signature on an act of mass murder. In March 1962, the highest-ranking generals in the United States military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sat around a heavy mahogany table. They weren't discussing defense. They weren't discussing the protection of the American people. They were finalizing a blueprint for manufactured terror. Operation Northwoods. This wasn't a rogue agent's fever dream. It was a formal, multi-page proposal to bomb American cities, hijack American planes, and shoot down American citizens in cold blood. The goal? To frame a foreign enemy, manipulate the emotions of the public, and start a war that the generals decided we needed, even if we didn't want it. Why would the men sworn to protect you decide that your life, your family's life, and your neighbor's life were just acceptable line items in a geopolitical budget? We've been conditioned for decades to believe that our leaders are the final line of defense against chaos. But these declassified files, pulled from the deepest shadows of the National Archives, tell a story of a betrayal so profound it shatters the foundation of the American identity. Today, we aren't just reading a script. We are peeling back the layers of a 1962 conspiracy that was one single signature away from becoming a reality. The cruel truth is, the plan was finished. The signatures were dry. The only thing missing was the go signal. To understand why General Lyman Lemnitzer and his colleagues thought they could get away with this, you have to understand the air they were breathing in 1962. Washington, D.C. was a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap tobacco, and the cold, metallic sweat of paranoia. The Cold War wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a religious war between two ideologies, and the devil lived 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Fidel Castro had done the unthinkable. He had turned Cuba, the playground of American billionaires and mobsters, into a Soviet outpost. To the men in the Pentagon, Cuba was a jagged knife held to the throat of the United States. Every morning, they woke up to the reality that Soviet-aligned bombers could reach Miami in minutes. But there was a deeper sting. A year earlier, the CIA had tried to topple Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a disaster. It was amateurish. It left the CIA humiliated, the military furious, and President John F. Kennedy deeply skeptical of his own intelligence advisors. The generals wanted blood. They wanted a full-scale invasion of Cuba to wipe the stain of the Bay of Pigs off the map. But they had a problem that no amount of tanks or planes could solve: the American public. In 1962, the average American family was focused on the new suburbs, the space race, and the promise of the new frontier. They didn't want another war. They didn't want their sons dying in the jungles of the Caribbean for a conflict they didn't fully understand. The public was the obstacle. How do you convince a nation that values its peace to suddenly demand a slaughter? How do you move a democratic people toward a war they've already rejected? You don't ask them. You manufacture a reason that leaves them no choice. You give them a pretext. Inside the windowless rooms of the Pentagon, a new and dangerous philosophy was taking root. It was the philosophy of total war. In this mindset, there were no civilians. There were only assets and liabilities. If the enemy wouldn't give you a reason to attack, you would simply put on the enemy's mask and attack yourself. Imagine the scene: General Lemnitzer, a man who had served with distinction in World War II, sitting with a map of Florida spread out before him. He isn't looking at the beaches or the tourists. He's looking at target zones. He's calculating how many American deaths it would take to trigger a useful outcry in the national media. Why would the most respected generals in the country view their own citizens as nothing more than pawns to be sacrificed for a strategic advantage? Is it possible that the institutions we build to protect us eventually become the very predators we fear? The morning of March 13, 1962, was cold and gray in the capital. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, walked into a meeting carrying a 13-page memorandum. It was addressed to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The title was clinical, almost boring, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. But as you flip through the pages of this declassified file, the clinical language begins to dissolve into something demonic. The Joint Chiefs didn't just suggest these ideas in a moment of brainstorming. They formalized them. They vetted them. They argued for them. The proposal suggested a series of well-coordinated incidents to be carried out in and around Guantanamo Bay and Miami. They suggested blowing up a U.S. ship in the harbor and blaming it on Cuba. They even used the phrase, "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba." Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Helpful wave of indignation. Think about that phrase. They were talking about the names of dead American sailors in the Sunday paper as a marketing tool for war. But it went much further than the military bases. The generals looked toward the civilian population. They suggested a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. They planned to plant fake Soviet explosives. They discussed exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots and then arresting Cuban agents. These were agents they would provide themselves with incriminating documents already prepared. They were going to orchestrate a bombing campaign against American citizens on American soil. If you were living in Miami in 1962, your own government was considering you a legitimate target for a controlled explosion. They wanted to sink a boatload of Cuban refugees on their way to Florida, real or simulated, the document said. They didn't care if the blood was real as long as the cameras caught it. They wanted to wound American citizens. They wanted to create a sense of panic so deep that the public would beg the military to invade Cuba. They were willing to manufacture funerals for mock victims to sell a fake war. Does the ink on a general's signature ever truly dry when it's used to sign the death warrants of the people he was sworn to protect? Lemnitzer and his team were convinced that this was the only way. They believed President Kennedy was soft. They believed he was a young, inexperienced politician who didn't have the stomach for the necessary evils of the Cold War. They thought that by presenting him with a pretext, a bloody, undeniable attack, they could force his hand. As Lemnitzer prepared to present this plan to the White House, he wasn't worried about the moral consequences. He was worried about the logistics. He was worried about the timing. He was operating in a world where the ends always justified the means, and the lives of individual Americans were just noise in the machine. What Lemnitzer didn't realize was that JFK had spent the last year learning to sleep with one eye open. The president was beginning to realize that the most dangerous men in the world weren't always in Moscow or Havana. Sometimes, they were the ones sitting across from him in the cabinet room, wearing the uniform of the United States. If you could step into that room at the Pentagon in 1962, you wouldn't find a group of madmen cackling over a map. You would find cold, professional, and terrifyingly rational officers. These were men who had built their careers on the logic of strategic necessity. To the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the American public wasn't a body of citizens to be served, it was a psychological variable to be manipulated. And throughout history, the most effective tool for mass manipulation has always been fear. The first phase of Operation Northwoods focused on the sun-drenched streets of Florida. The generals proposed a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area. But these weren't just vague threats written in a memo. The document outlined a step-by-step guide to domestic terrorism. They suggested blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba. They even considered sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees en route to Florida. In the clinical language of the document, it didn't seem to matter if these refugees were real or simulated. The objective was the image, the sight of bodies in the water, the headlines in the Miami Herald. And the gut-wrenching realization for the American public that the enemy was at the gates. But the plan went deeper into the heart of American cities. The Joint Chiefs discussed exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots. They weren't looking for maximum casualties, they were looking for maximum psychological impact. A bomb in a trash can near a shopping center. A small explosion at a local government building. Just enough to shatter the peace of the suburbs. After the explosions, the script called for the discovery of Cuban agents. These agents would, of course, be U.S. intelligence assets playing a role. They would be arrested with incriminating documents, fake Soviet manuals, maps of Miami with targets circled in red, and letters written in Spanish. Imagine walking to work in 1962, smelling the sea air of Miami, and being caught in a blast orchestrated not by a foreign dictator, but by your own government. The plan was designed to create a useful outcry. The generals knew they needed the mothers of America to demand a war. They knew that for the average citizen to support an invasion, they needed to feel that their own children were no longer safe in their own backyards. The document even calculated the staging of fake funerals for mock victims. They were prepared to pay for the caskets, the flowers, and the grieving families, all to sell a war that existed only in the minds of the military elite. But how do you create a fake massacre that the entire world believes is real? You don't just use bombs. You use the sky. The most sophisticated, and perhaps the most chilling, part of the Northwoods proposal was the ghost plane operation. This was the crown jewel of the false flag kitsch ban. It was a masterpiece of deception that required a level of logistical precision usually reserved for a moon landing. The military proposed taking a real civilian aircraft and painting it to look exactly like a chartered flight belonging to a CIA front company. They would fill it with selected passengers. These wouldn't be families on vacation, they would be intelligence agents briefed on a mission that required absolute silence. This plane would take off from an airfield in Florida, officially heading toward Jamaica or another Caribbean destination. It would be assigned a real flight number. It would appear on civilian radar. For all intents and purposes, it was a normal passenger flight. But as the plane reached a specific point over the Caribbean, the magic trick would begin. At a predetermined coordinate, out of sight of land, the real plane would descend rapidly, slipping below the radar horizon and heading for a secret auxiliary base. At that exact moment, a drone, a pilotless duplicate of the airliner, painted in the same colors, would take its place in the sky. To the controllers on the ground, nothing had changed. The blip on the radar screen remained the same. The drone would then begin to broadcast on an international distress frequency. The world would hear the panicked voice of a pilot claiming he was being intercepted by Cuban MiG fighters. The audio would be scripted. The pilot would scream that he was under fire, that his engines were failing, that Castro's Air Force was murdering American civilians in cold blood. Then, the drone would be remotely detonated. In a flash of fire over the ocean, the proof of Cuban aggression would be created. There would be no survivors to tell the truth. There would be no evidence left but a few pieces of floating debris and the recorded screams on a radio frequency. The Joint Chiefs were prepared to play a shell game with human lives. They were ready to swap a real plane for a ghost, all to buy the political capital for an invasion. Does the government still own the technology to perform these kinds of swaps today? In 1962, they were already discussing unmanned aircraft and remote detonation. Imagine what they have now that they aren't telling us. This wasn't just a what-if scenario. It was a formal recommendation from the highest level of the U.S. military. The generals weren't asking if it was moral. They were only asking if it would work. They were counting on the fact that no one would ever suspect the men in the Pentagon of such a grotesque betrayal. They knew that if the ghost plane went down, the American people would be so consumed by grief and rage that they would never stop to ask if the wreckage was real. A plane full of passengers vanishes, but in reality, it never even took off. The truth is right here in this 1962 file, and it's enough to shake anyone who still believes in the inherent goodness of the state. As the ghost plane plan sat on the desk of the Secretary of Defense, one final hurdle remained. The plan needed the approval of the man who occupied the most powerful office in the world. And General Lemnitzer was confident that the young president, still reeling from the Bay of Pigs, would finally see things the military's way. The air in the Oval Office is different than anywhere else in the world. It is a room designed for the weight of history, but on March 13, 1962, that weight felt like lead. The morning sun was likely streaming through the large windows, catching the dust motes dancing over the heavy oak of the resolute desk. President John F. Kennedy sat in his rocking chair, a chair he used to ease the constant pain in his back, and waited for his chairman of the Joint Chiefs. General Lyman Lemnitzer walked in with the gait of a man who believed he was about to save his country. He wasn't bringing a request, he was bringing a solution. He placed the 13-page memorandum for Operation Northwoods on the desk. Imagine the silence in that room as Kennedy began to read. JFK was not a stranger to the realities of war. He was a man who had seen the Pacific turn red with the blood of his own crew on the PT-109. He knew the smell of salt water mixed with burning diesel. He knew that war wasn't a clinical exercise, it was a brutal, chaotic thief of youth. As he turned the pages, he saw the plans for the bombings in Miami. He saw the ghost plane swap. He saw the funerals for mock victims. And he saw something that Lemnitzer, in all his years of military service, had failed to grasp. He saw that the Rangioi, the border, between a statesman and an assassin had just been erased. The president didn't just disagree with the tactics. He was repulsed by the philosophy. He realized that the men he had appointed to lead the military were now suggesting he become the very monster he was trying to fight in Havana and Moscow. If you sacrifice the soul of your nation to save its borders, what exactly have you saved? Lemnitzer pushed. He argued that the Cuban threat was an existential cancer that needed to be cut out at any cost. He believed the American public was too soft, and that they needed a shock to wake them up to the reality of the Cold War. But Kennedy remained silent. He looked at the general and realized he was looking at an internal threat far more complex than a revolutionary in Cuba. What did Kennedy see in Lemnitzer's eyes at that moment? Was it the cold calculation of a man who had spent too many years staring at troop movements? Kennedy didn't just say, no. He shut the file with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. He made it clear that as long as he occupied that chair, Operation Northwoods would remain a nightmare confined to paper. But in that moment, the bridge between the White House and the Pentagon didn't just crack. It collapsed. The aftermath of that meeting was not a public explosion, but a quiet, surgical operation. Kennedy was a politician. He knew that firing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs immediately would trigger a civil war within his own administration. He couldn't afford a scandal while the Soviet Union was watching. So, he waited. A few months later, when Lemnitzer's term as chairman came up for renewal, Kennedy did something that sent a shockwave through the Pentagon. He refused to reappoint him. Instead, he shuffled Lemnitzer off to Europe to serve as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. It was a prestigious title, but in the world of Washington power, it was a professional exile. Lemnitzer was removed from the president's inner circle. But a signature can be rejected, while a war machine keeps turning. The rejection of Operation Northwoods created a deep, festering resentment within the military-industrial complex. The generals felt betrayed. In their eyes, the president was soft on communism. They believed he was a young, reckless amateur who was preventing the professionals from doing what was necessary. The seeds of a deep state mentality began to sprout in the shadows, the idea that the military knew what was best for the country, even if the elected leaders didn't. The proposal for Northwoods was placed in a heavy steel filing cabinet and stamped, top secret. It was buried so deep it was meant to stay hidden until the end of time. But while the paper stayed still, the world kept moving. Kennedy was gone just over a year later, his life ended in the bright sun of Dallas. For decades, the story of a government plan to kill its own people was nothing more than a ghost story. It was the kind of thing whispered by conspiracy theorists in the dark corners of libraries. People said it was impossible. They said the US government would never plan a false flag against its own citizens. They said the Joint Chiefs were honorable men, patriots who would never dream of such a betrayal. But history is a patient hunter. And the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, even from the deepest archives of the Pentagon. The turning point came in 1997. It wasn't because of a sudden change of heart by the government. It was because of the public pressure generated by the 1991 film JFK. The American people demanded to know the truth about their history, leading to the formation of the Assassination Records Review Board. They began prying open the rusted steel doors of the Cold War archives. And there, tucked away in the files of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they found the 13 pages that changed everything. The declassification of Operation Northwoods didn't just add a footnote to history, it shattered a foundation of trust. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a documented, signed, and vetted historical fact. The American public was forced to confront a reality where their own military leaders had formally proposed a campaign of domestic terrorism. Truth doesn't die, it just waits in a drawer until everyone who signed the paper is gone. The revelation of Northwoods provided a blueprint for every doubt we feel today. It is the reason why, when the official story feels a little too perfect, a segment of the population looks back at 1962 and asks, could it happen again? How many other accidents in history were actually Northwoods 2.0? We see the shadow of this document in the skepticism surrounding every major event of the last 50 years. It proved that at the highest levels of power, the ends can justify almost any means, no matter how blood-soaked they might be. Here is the final twist that the history books are still trying to ignore. The men who signed Operation Northwoods were never punished. They weren't court-martialed. They didn't lose their pensions or their standing in society. General Lemnitzer lived a long, respected life. He was hailed as a patriot and a hero of the Republic. He died in 1988, 9 years before the world found out what he had truly proposed. The document was rejected by Kennedy, but the logic, the cold, clinical logic of the false flag, didn't die with the memo. It was merely upgraded. In 1962, they needed plastic bombs and ghost planes. Today, the tools are much quieter. We don't need explosions in the streets when we have cyber attacks that can shut down a power grid. We don't need to hijack a plane when we can manipulate the digital flow of information to make people believe whatever we want. The philosophy of Operation Northwoods has been digitized, refined, and woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Hidden Pulse isn't here to tell you what to believe. We are here to show you the archive. We look at these grainy 35mm photos and these yellowed pages not to live in the past, but to understand the hidden pulse of the present. The archives are open now, but the shadows are just as long as they were in 1962. Are you sure you are living in a reality that hasn't been scripted? Or are we all just characters in a play written decades ago, waiting for the next incitement to justify the next war? If this journey into the Northwoods files changed how you see the world today, join us. Subscribe to the archive. Stay vigilant. The truth is always there, hidden in the grain of the film, waiting for someone with the courage to look. I'm your host for Hidden Pulse. The Operation Northwoods file is now closed. Until the next archive opens. Stay sharp.